Hi everybody, Kim here at Olive City Homestead. It is a cold, gray, rainy day, but not so yesterday. I filmed the bulk of this video when it was sunny and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Right now it is rainy and it is not 65, it's about 50. Tomorrow is supposed to be 65 again and sunny. The next day, back to this. I guess that's the definition of spring here in Northern California for the most part. But something that is not normally done in spring in most areas of the US and probably a lot of areas around the world is dividing and replanting iris. Specifically, I'm doing tall bearded irises. So can this work contrary to what most people tell you? Yes, it can. You can totally successfully transplant irises in the spring. Now, will they bloom? Well, as you'll see in this video, I mentioned a couple of times that that's not a guarantee. Maybe they won't bloom until next year. But I have had success in the past with dividing other irises in the spring, and they did bloom that same year. So you never know unless you try. But the fact is that fall is often a very busy time of year for me for several reasons, and so I frequently don't get around to dividing big clumps of irises. It just gets put off, as it did this time. This particular large area of tall bearded purple and yellow irises is in a spot that it shouldn't have been planted, as were the previous irises that I had to dig up, divide, and transplant. They were apricot irises. Both of these were here when I moved here 8 years ago, and both were planted in inappropriate spots. As you'll see with the ones I'm doing today, they spread under a deck. The apricot ones that I did a few years ago were in shade, so they never bloomed. After I moved them, they did bloom, even that first year. So let's get on with the video and you'll see how to divide and replant your irises, whether it is fall, like when you're supposed to do them, or springtime, like I'm doing them. At the end of the video, I will show you a way to almost guarantee that the irises that you divide this year will still give you blooms. It requires just a little trick, and I didn't do it because it's not really that important to me whether they bloom this year or next. I have so many other things blooming, but it does work. I've done it before, and so have others, so I'll show you that right at the end. The time has come to dig up and divide and replant in various spots these beautiful bearded irises that have spread under this old deck. Every year I think I'm gonna dig those up and divide them and spread them out, and I never get around to it. So I'm gonna do it today. I probably will clear some ground here and plant them a little further out because I had to block off this deck for purposes of adopting a dog, which I'm still trying to do. The railing there will actually provide a nice way to tie up any super heavy irises, which I've had grow here in the past. So this area here in front of the pool on the other side of the deck has a strawberry tree and some nandinas I want to plant. Hopefully they'll come back. They suffered greatly in the very cold rain and windstorm we had 2 weeks ago. Should have already replanted them, but actually they look like they were pretty much dead, and so I didn't, but they've come back somewhat, so I think they're going to make it. I'm going to plant them in the ground, actually. The corner there has all my daffodil bulbs and another strawberry tree, so I'm going to fill this area up with bearded irises. It gets sun from early morning, 6 a.m., 7 a.m., whenever the sun rises, until about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And with our kind of intense sun, that should be plenty for the bearded irises. So what I'm doing here is pulling back the mulch and kind of breaking up the soil underneath. And I'm going to dig trenches or holes, probably more like trenches, in the places that I'm going to put the rhizomes. And 6 to 10 inches down is what you need. And that's just for the roots. The rhizomes you're going to put on top of little mounds and have the roots drape down the mounds. So it's very simple. Anything you read will tell you to plant the rhizomes with most of their surface above ground. If you do live in an area like I do, however, where the sun is 100 to 115 degrees in the summer, and it's that hot, you want to probably cover up not all of the rhizome, but a good deal of it with just a very light layer of soil. And that's how they were planted where I'm digging them up from. And I'm going to continue that here because they have done well there, just spreading the wrong direction. So I have dug up the first half of them, or maybe a third of them so far, the front part, which is going to be the easiest. The part that's under the deck is going to be harder to get to, hoping I can do that without breaking any of the rhizomes. But basically, after you dig or fork deeply underneath, and you don't have to go that deep because the roots are horizontal and shallow on these rhizomes, but after you get down about, I'd say 5 or 6 inches, maybe 8 if you want to be super safe, and you go underneath the plants, then you can take them off in clumps. As you can see here, this clump is about a foot wide and about 8 inches across. And the rhizomes are right here. And they're connected, but they break apart really easily. And if you do slice off like the edge, like right here, that's really not going to matter. What matters is the end where it's coming out. In fact, you will have to slice through some of them to disconnect them that don't break apart easily. Some came out in a small little clump, so here I've got 2, and you could leave those together or you can break them apart. Thought I'd have a hard time getting these out. They were flush against the steps, but I just put the shovel straight down in here, and the step is actually hollow, so I was able to go back just, well, it's not hollow, but it has an indentation of like 2 inches. I was able to go back in here and go straight down and kind of push them this way, because if you see the leaves coming straight up, you know that's the end of the flowering end of the rhizome, so you can feel safe going down next to it and pushing against it. And that's what I did, and now I'm able to pull out all those rhizomes. They really are shallow and horizontally rooted, so it's not that difficult to do. And now I should be able to get the other ones, and very simply. And as you can see, the Bermuda grass, although mostly dying, has spread in and amongst these. But that's okay, because what I'm going to do is, after I get them all out, I'm going to hose them down real well and pull off any of the Bermuda grass roots, so that when I put them in their new spot, there won't be any Bermuda grass being spread. That's very important. All right, I finished. I got everything out from under the deck, and that soil looks really good. It feels really good. Lots of earthworms in there. And I got all the bearded irises out, and oh my goodness, this last bit was all in one huge clump. Look at the size of those rhizomes. That's all one big clump. Here's one that has a really long rhizome, and that may end up all getting cut off of it rather. It depends. If there's any buds along it that look like they might grow, then I'll cut them and plant them separately. But I'm going to be hosing all these off now and separating them. And look what I found. And I'm sure there are more of these. These just happen to come right off. Little tiny baby ones. This is only like as long as my finger. So I'm going to plant these tiny ones in pots and see how I can do with those. And I had some little medium-sized ones. So yeah, all different sizes, and I'm gonna plant some back in there, but not close to the rail like it was. So I'm gonna get to work now and hose these off. I'll show them to you once I get them all cleaned up right before I plant them. But here I'm gonna show you what these look like when they're in bloom. All right, with this rhizome clump, you can see now that I've hosed it off, the roots are clear, but so also are the divisions where you could gently break off a rhizome just like that. And now you have your own separate little rhizome. Actually, this is a good size one. Let's see what else we've got here. So this is coming out of this one. So I'm going to break it gently right there. See how gentle that was, and it comes right off. Now I have a nice one there. And this is the long one, and we can see a baby one. I'm not going to break that off. This kind of looks dead to me, but yet it has a lot of roots and some what looks like some buds. So what I'm going to do is break it right there where it's naturally going to break. And now we have this bud growing out of this one. And I'm going to leave that. And then I'm going to plant this just in case. Also remember at this time to take off any of the old dead leaves. They'll just peel right away from the rhizome at the base of the new fan-shaped leaves. Now, when you transplant, you're supposed to cut the leaves at about a 6-inch level in a fan shape. And I'll show you that once we do that at planting time. Now here is an interesting example I've got on this rhizome. 2 separate buds coming up with their fan-shaped leaves on the end, growing out of the end of this rhizome. And I could either plant them together and let them get stronger or break them apart. And really there's not a right or wrong way to do it. In fact, you'll find differing opinions on it. And this falls into the category, in my opinion, of experimenting and seeing how it turns out and then deciding what you want to do next time around. Another thing this rhizome can show you, if I can get it close enough, let's see. Right here is a bud. I want to make sure that I leave that with enough roots that it can develop if it's going to develop. Now here is another interesting example. This little rhizome is about 1 inch long, and you can see coming out of it is about 1/4 of an inch of a bud. And I believe that's going to grow because it has a lot of roots on it, and that bud's coming out strong. So that's going to go in a pot. So these big clumps, the easiest way to get them apart is as you're spraying the water to gently jiggle and rock, and you'll feel them pull away. And now I have this whole section. And I will break it apart in a moment. Now I will come back to the clump, spray some more. And as you do that and you pull parts away, not hard, you won't feel any breaking, it'll just slip away. You'll be able to see into the center better. So the center, as you can see, can come apart more easily once you know what's there. So after I've sprayed it, I will pull away the dead leaves, and this reveals the rhizomes and where they're connected and where they've died off. Like they sort of collapse in on themselves as they die off, and rhizomes spread from the center outward, and so it makes sense that at the very center of a clump, you're going to find the collapsed dead ones, and they just cut off very easily. Normally I would break this one off of the rhizome, but I don't see any buds coming out of this long, thicker rhizome, so I'm going to actually leave that one. It's good to hold these at the base near the fan-shaped leaves as you tear the old leaves off, because you don't want to accidentally break the rhizome right near the narrow, more vulnerable part by the where the green growth is coming out of. Now, this rhizome, unlike the last one I showed you, does have a bud coming out of it right here. So I'm going to break both of these off. And that leaves this rhizome with this bud on it right there. And I will direct that going upward. Careful when you're pulling off the leaves. It's super simple to pull them off, but often they're right next to roots. Don't accidentally pull roots off, because those are important. The reason those dead leaves are on, if you haven't grown
bearded irises before is because the leaves on bulb plants, for the most part, you leave them on until they're fully brown. After the flower has bloomed, those green leaves still keep sucking in the nutrition from the sun and feeding the rhizome bulb. So you don't want to cut off the green leaves after your flowers are spent. Leave them on. You can take them off once they're all brown, but you know, at that point they've pretty much collapsed to the ground, so you don't notice them. But you should take them off in the spring, you know. To be honest, if you don't, they end up just mulching the plant, but that's my opinion. In general, most people do take them off once they're brown.
All right, I have finished separating and cleaning all the plants, and I have separated them now according to size of the actual leaves and the rhizomes, and I have 130, and probably 30 of those have at least 2 coming out of the rhizome, 2 flowering stalks instead of just 1. But for one reason or another, I didn't feel it was good to separate them. So now I'm going to cover them, the ones that aren't in the shade. Now it's time to get the ground ready and get these in the ground. If you want to, you can add a little bit of fertilizer. They like a low nitrogen fertilizer. Make sure it's organic, or you can use homegrown compost as long as it's a low nitrogen fertilizer. That's all that really matters. These bulbs, though, the bulk of them are large enough. They have everything in them that they actually need to grow well. Okay, I'm starting to get them planted.
So I'm leaving about half of the rhizome exposed, less than most people would because of my intense summers. And I thought I would show you how I'm going to put one in the ground. So you want the side that the roots are coming out on, because usually they are on one side more than the other, deeper. And you want in the middle where the rhizome's going to set to be mounded. Okay, so it sits on top of it and the roots drape down on the side. You also want to have it situated so that it's straight up and down. You don't want it leaning one way or backwards. You want it straight up and down, and I'm centering it between the 2 behind it and keeping about 12 inches between them. It's that easy. You don't really dig a hole. The most you're working with is a hand shovel, little trowel, or your hands. I use my hands and get them dirty, but that works best for me.
So there are 12 now planted in front of the deck, not under the deck, and I think those should do really well. And then I have a bunch of small ones that are totally an experiment planted in these pots because they really don't have much of a rhizome. So these were ones that broke off that I didn't intend to break off while I was taking them out. So I'm not sure that they won't rot because the rhizomes, the small bit of rhizome on each of them is very difficult to get to stay above the soil level. So we'll see how those do. And then I planted up the bed in front of the pool, as I said I was going to, and I think it looks really good. I don't know how, it's gonna turn out. They may be too close together. I did put them a foot apart. That's what you're supposed to. So I tried for that, and we'll see how it looks. I hope they bloom this spring, but I'm not counting on it because they often don't after you transplant them for a year or so. Also, these, as you can see, are in the shade. They get more shade than that side. So they still are going to get a ton of sun and heat, so I think they'll do all right. But again, we'll just have to see how that goes this spring and more than likely next spring, because that's probably when they'll start to bloom. But I'm really happy. So far I've planted 85, and the rest I'm going to find places out front or somewhere else because this is full. And then I have all of these parts of rhizomes that either I think look dead or I can't find any buds on, but I'm going to go through them one more time before I get rid of them. And I probably, knowing me, will plant them in some spot just to see if any come up. Okay guys, well that took a little longer than I thought it would because there were so many of those. Oh yes, and today it's raining, cold, so I'm not gonna plant the remaining, what is it, like 45 rhizomes. I'm going to do that tomorrow when it's supposed to be sunny and warm again. But I asked you to stay tuned to the end if you wanted to see how you can guarantee that your plants will still bloom this year if you replant them in the spring. And here's how. These two tools, or even just one of them actually, will help you if you know what to do. So this is actually an edger, and I use it anywhere I have a straight edge like cement steps or just a sidewalk, and I want to cut through whatever's growing right up against that edge. I'm sure you're familiar with it. But it works really well for what I was talking about, helping your irises that you're dividing to still bloom that same season. The other tool that you could use instead is this, a hori. There's an American version too. I'm not sure what they call it, but it's a knife, a very sharp, handy knife in the garden. It has a serrated edge on one side and a straight, sharp edge on the other side. And what can you do with these two tools? Well, the trick to getting your irises to bloom that same season when you're dividing them is to not take them all out. If instead you just take a portion of your large clump of irises and leave a portion behind, the part you leave behind will definitely bloom that same season. And if when you take that portion out, you leave it in a clump rather than dividing it as I did, then that clump has a very good chance of also blooming that same season. And as I said, I didn't really care about the bloom coming the same season, and I've actually had it work even doing it the way I did it by separating them all singly. But if you really want to be sure that you get those blooms, then only take out a portion and leave a portion undisturbed. So these tools, the edger and the hori, they help you divide your irises without resorting to a shovel to dig them out from underneath their roots. What you do is take either one of these tools and find the center, as I showed you in the video, and cut straight down into those rhizomes right at the center. Then get your shovel and dig out just the portion that you want to move somewhere else, leaving behind the other. You haven't disturbed it at all, so it will bloom. And these two tools, a sharp edger or a sharp hori, is what's going to enable you to cut right through those rhizomes very easily, kind of like going through butter. And that's all there is to it. It's simple and easy, and it works. One of the reasons, though, that I did it the way I did it, aside from not really caring too much whether they bloom this year, is that I wanted to arrange the iris plants in a very specific way. I wanted to, put them in an area in a pattern, and that worked much better for me than the typical clump arrangements. I mean, where I planted will spread into clumps, but the original planting is very much a pattern design that I wanted to try. So thanks for joining me yesterday and today as I worked on my bearded iris project. I'm so happy and proud of myself for finally getting around to that because I've been putting it off, procrastinating for several years. But it's done, or almost done now, and I'm really happy about it. Okay, I'm gonna head inside now. It is cold out here in this wet, rainy weather, and anyway, it's about time to start some seeds. Remember, folks, you can create the life and the garden you want. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.